Apologies, all I'm having some internet issues, so I was going to just play the intro. Apologies, all I'm having some internet issues, so I was. Hello there. Right, let's get this going. I just want to let's get to the comments. Okay. Hello there, Tommy Stiggs. Thank you. Hello, Paul. Good to see you as always. Thanks for coming. Same to you as well there, Dave T. Thank you. ALV, thank you. Great, good to see you all. I was going to play my intro, but I'm having a bit of internet issues, so what I will do is I will just have a recap from episode 2 for episode 3, part 3, and we'll just go through the details. And what I will say is this before we kick off, is that all the information I am providing to you is in the public domain. And while elements may be true, not all of it can be verified as 100% accurate. This live is educational, entertainment, satire purposes, and is based on a book that I will be mentioning on the show, as well as other web articles freely available in the public domain. And all descriptions or labels are either rumoured or alleged, unless they are convicted by criminal law. Okay, so I'm just going to do that. El Toro, good to see you. Okay. Here we go. The recap of part 2. Now, as I mentioned earlier in that episode, Mick McAvoy met a character nicknamed the Fox. Now, the Fox was allegedly a fence who would finance jobs in the underworld. Mick met him in a West End nightclub, and the Fox had a reputation, and it was alleged that he funded the Great Train Robbery and many other big scores. Now, McAvoy, Robinson, and their other mate partner in crime, Tony White, even tried to finance this complex and risky job themselves by carrying out a robbery of a security van, which they believed would be carrying £250,000 in cash. So they wanted to finance the Brinks-Mat raid themselves. And the reason why they did this is because they didn't want to share the spoils from this new big job with people like the Fox and his band of armchair villains. But after the relatively simple hold-up, McAvoy and the gang were bitterly disappointed only to discover they'd only managed to steal about 30 grand in total. Each member of the team was given a few £1,000s to tide them over until the next big job, whilst the rest of the money was put aside for further scores down the line. However, McAvoy and Robinson had little option but to accept that they needed some serious financial backing after the disastrously low amount of cash obtained from the previous robbery. So McAvoy got in contact with a character we met earlier, the Fox, who pledged to upfront cash to the gang if they went after any really big targets. Now there would have to be some serious investment of cash in certain items before they were fully ready to pull off the Brinks-Mat raid. The Fox introduced McAvoy and Robinson to a family of North London criminals called the Adamses, or known as the A-Team. Now, the A-Team was headed up by Terry Adams and his brothers, Tommy Adams and Patsy Adams. They were the three eldest of 11 children who had been brought up as Irish Catholics in a North London council flat. They'd first broken through in the underworld by using their fists to extort money from market stall holders. This had been followed by a meteoric rise to power in the late 1970s and the early 80s, thanks to drug trafficking, extortion, hijackings, security fraud, and large-scale blaggings. So, based in Clerkenwell, in North London, the Adams family managed to evade prosecution for years by running their syndicate at arm's length. Their reputation for violence meant that they were regarded to be worse than the Crays and the Richardsons. Now, McAvoy and Robinson, they didn't really trust anyone outside their circle, so they were all very apprehensive on wanting to work with other criminals. Now, however, there was a robber who was then going to join their team, Georgie Boy Francis. So George Francis had been allegedly been shipping in cannabis from Pakistan, and on the 5th shipment, him and his crew, the crew that he was with, customer and excise officers moved in, and sadly, a customs and excise officer lost his life, and one of the gang, Lenny Watkins, had allegedly shot and killed the officer. Now, with Georgie Boy in a lot of trouble, he was on trial, but what had allegedly happened is that Terry Adams somehow managed to influence and get Georgie Boy off with what he was being convicted for. So Georgie Boy is now going to join Mickey and Brian as one of the team members. But I also want to mention as well, I mentioned in the earlier episode, was John Little Legs Lloyd. He was a robber from East London, but had moved down to Kent. Now, adding further to this, Terry Adams then put the team on to another contact, and that was Brian Wright, known as the Milkman. Now, the Milkman was renowned for money laundering, but has been convicted for major drug smuggling. Now, yet again, McAvoy and Robinson were very apprehensive about this because they didn't really trust anyone. They only liked to work with people off their own manner. But they still realised that they needed to have more bodies on board to pull off this complex job. And that brought in another character, Mickey Green. He was nicknamed the Pimpernel because of his extraordinary ability to avoid arrests. Green had first cut his criminal teeth as a robber in a notorious gang from Wembley, which is northwest London. And in the late 1960s, but by the early 80s, he'd spread his wings far and wide and was well known to the underworlds of both London and southern Spain, as well as Southern Ireland. He was an expert at money laundering large stolen amounts of cash and knew all the tricks of the trade, and over the coming years he'd have a significant part to play in the Brinks-Mat story. Okay, now off to the start of the heist. Right, everyone, thank you for coming. Thank you, team. Good to see you, Paul, Marta, Dave T. All good, folks. I'm glad you're here. Now I'm going to play the intro that I should have played at the beginning, but due to internet. So please enjoy. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed the intro. Thank you, Tinu and Dave T. Yes, right, Paul. Thank you as well. Yeah, it is ska music. I love ska music, reggae music. Hello there, Marta. Good to see you. Right, I'm going to get straight into it now. So I'm going to get going. I will take a look at the chat, but I just want to try and get as much information as I can out, and then I'll stop and pause. And any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, right, here we go. I'm going on Avatar. Okay, so it's Hounslow, West London, 6:25 a.m., the 26th of November, 1983. If it wasn't for the CCTV cameras and spotlights mounted on the walls of Unit 7, a steel brick and built box on a scruffy trading estate near Heathrow Airport is the unlikely building that would have caught the attention of even the most curious onlookers. But when the huge orange and white armoured shutter doors rolled open, its real purpose was revealed. Chunky, dark blue Brinks-Mat vans were barred and tinted black windows and went from the well-protected loading bay day and night. Unit 7 wasn't Fort Knox or the Bank of England, but it did hold one of Britain's largest safes used to store currency, precious metals and other high-value consignments en route for Heathrow Airport. Now, it was still pitch black and icy cold that Saturday morning as the early shift of workers waited outside, kicking their heels and blowing clouds of condensation while waiting for the 6:30 a.m. opening time. This was when the automatic timer would neutralise the sophisticated alarm systems, allowing the keys to be inserted without triggering the flashing lights, bells and alarms that were linked to the local police station and other security companies. Security guard Richard Holliday had been the first to arrive in his beige Ford Console. He was quickly followed by another guard, Ron Clark, on his moped. Guards Peter Bentley and Robin Risley pulled up moments later, and the four men mumbled greetings to one another. The fifth guard, rostered for duty, was Brian Robinson's brother-in-law, Tony Black. Typically, he was late and still hadn't arrived when Supervisor Michael Scouse, 37, drove up. Scouse, a former special constable, was the longest-serving member of staff on duty that day, with 12 years on the Brinks-Mat payroll. His seniority singled him out the morning as the key man. Scouse entered the unit alone and locked the door behind him. Leaving the crew outside while he went to the downstairs office and collected the key from the safe, this switched off the alarm system, covering the perimeter walls and windows. He went back to the main door to allow the rest of the crew in. The outside door was relocked from inside before Scouse reactivated the alarm system, climbed the stairs and walked through to the radio control room to look through the paperwork for the day's duties. Meanwhile, the other four figures went into the restroom to take off their coats. Holiday paused briefly to switch on the radio room aerials and the surveillance cameras before joining his mates. Just then the doorbell rang. The guards heard Scouse go down the stairs to let in Tony Black, who was 10 minutes late. "You look a bit rough," quipped guard Bentley as Black walked into the restroom. The 31-year-old Black did indeed look pale, unkempt and unapprehensive, as if he was just clammed out of bed and raced to work. He confirmed Bentley's suspicion that he had overslept, then mumbling something about having to use the toilet. He disappeared downstairs again. Risley glanced at his watch. It was 6:40 a.m. Robbers Brian Robinson and Mickey McAvoy, Tony White, Brian Perry, and two other men were sitting in the stolen blue transit van on the Heathrow Trading Estate, waiting for their inside man Black to give them the signal. Black would then let them into the Brinks-Mat warehouse where the gang had been told there were the goods, gold, cash and jewellery, worth up to £3 million. Now, thanks to Tony Black, the robbers even knew which one of the two security guards had the combination numbers to allow access to the safes located in the vaults. Black hadn't gone to the toilet. He had gone to the front door to let in McAvoy and his gang. Brinks-Mat's so-called state-of-the-art vault in their warehouse was protected by nothing more than a single fixed surveillance camera inside the building, which was the one opposite the side of the main door to the vault. There was an alarm on the door which sounded when the gang pushed their way in, but no one could possibly hear it upstairs, nor was it connected to anything outside the trading estate. "Get on the floor, you're fucking dead." The masked figure filling the doorway of the restroom upstairs spat out the words in a harsh Cockney accent, motioning urgently to stun guards with a 9mm Browning automatic. Robin Risley dived from his chair to the floor, quickly followed by Clark on holiday. "The first thing I knew," recalled Risley, the guard who, along with the scouts, had the combination numbers, was a man pointing a semi-automatic pistol at my face and telling us to hit the floor. From the ground, Risley caught a brief glimpse of a white man, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, wearing a trilby hat and a dark car coat or anorak over a black blazer, black trousers and a black tie. He might have been dressed for a funeral, but for the yellow balaclava that all but covered his eyes. Now, for a tense beat or two, nothing happened. Something called it a hesitant silence. Then the gunman with the Browning automatic made a move that was to earn him the nickname the Bully. Among the guards, without a word, he jerked his weapon arm upwards and a silver blaze button, glinting in the neon light, smashed the weapon down on the back of the guard Peter Bentley's neck. Now, the guard had angered him by being too slow to react when the door first crashed open, believing it to be a colleague playing one of their regular practical jokes. He stood by the sink, continuing to make tea. As he slumped to the ground, Bentley's head hit the table and then the floor, dazing him momentarily and opening up 2 deep bloody gashes in his scalp. Now, the attacker's gun arm then calmly beckoned through the door to someone waiting outside, and 3 more robbers rushed into the room. "Lie still and be fucking quiet," ordered the Bully as his henchmen began to immobilize the terrified guards, yanking their arms behind their backs and handcuffing them before binding their legs together at the shins with heavy-duty tape. Cloth bags with strings were then pulled down over the guards' heads and fastened around their necks. One of the guards was close enough to the gunman to distinguish the herringbone pattern of the tweed hat and the crispness of his starch white shirt. He even saw a lock of fair hair protruding from the balaclava as the bag was placed over his head. Bentley felt hands roughly pulling at the house and car keys on his belt. Then his watch was snatched off and thrown across the room. Blood from his throbbing neck trickled down his face and neck. A moment later, a voice, sound almost sympathetic, asked if he was okay. Bentley nodded, and then drawstring was loosened a little. Meanwhile, Holiday was finding it difficult to breathe. Thrashing about on the floor, he attracted the attention of one of the robbers, who bent down and untied the drawstring, pulling the bag to clear his upper lip. To ease the discomfort further, he turned on his back. Ron Clark was similarly treated, first roughly bound, then casually asked if he was in any distress. Moments later, another robber spoke, this time with no discredible accent, and barked out his orders. "Get the radio tuned in. If you hear anything, tell us." He ordered one of the robbers. The guards immediately realised that the man was the commanding officer. Seconds later, several of the robbers left the room. Then a radio crackled through the frequencies as it tuned into a Metropolitan Police wavelength. There was precious little happening outside the Brinks-Mat warehouse. 2 police officers could be heard discussing a spot check on a vehicle, but there was nothing else. 2 members of the gang then returned and hauled Holiday to his feet before dragging him down the corridor into the locker room. He was then lowered to the floor and pushed back against a girder. They tried to handcuff him to the steel strut, but failed because he was too large for his arms to encircle. He was then handcuffed to a radiator instead. Fellow guard Ron Clark was then hauled in and handcuffed to the same radiator. They were left alone to listen to the noises echoing in the vault directly below them. Senior guard Scouse was pulled to his feet in the restroom and dragged outside the corridor, where he was thrown against the wall. "Breathe in," ordered one of the robbers. Scouse felt his shirt being pulled up to his chin and then hand tugged violently at his waistband. Breathe in deeply or you'll get fucking cut. Just then the knife slid through his belted jeans from the buckle to the crutch. A scouse filled his lungs. He became aware of an overpowering smell. Had a rag waved under his nose. Scouse and Risley had been identified earlier by Tony Black as the men who held the combinations. Now their ordeal was about to begin in earnest. Risley recalled, they slipped a hood on my head and then there was a knife in the crotch of my trousers, and before I could say anything, they were around my ankles and there was liquid being poured on me. Scouse recalled, I heard this voice say, if we don't get what we want, if the police turn up or the alarms go off, then the voice stopped momentarily. Do you recognise that smell? One robber, identified as Mickey McAvoy, then poured petrol into the Scouse's lap. The next instant, Scouse felt the fuel seeping into his genitals. You better do as I fucking say, or I'll put a match to the petrol and a bullet through your fucking head, said McAvoy. I know you live in that flat in Rice High Street with a TV rental shop. We've been watching you for 9 months and setting this up for 12. Now let's get on with it. You have 2 numbers. The 2 guards were taken down to the vault, which they believed held £1 million in used banknotes. Scouse punched in his half of the combination, but when Risley was pushed forward to complete the sequence, there was a problem. Risley later recalled, the company had just changed the combinations and I hadn't memorised the new one, so they wouldn't open the safe. They felt I was messing about, I heard someone say. It looks like we got a hero. And then he started rattling the matchbox in front of my face and then pulled out a diver's knife and said he was going to castrate me if I didn't give him the numbers. He was furious. Well, I was doing my best. After 20 minutes of trying and failing to break into the safe, the robbers turned their attention to the drums and boxes scattered around the floor. As they opened up various lids and discovered scrap silver, degraded platinum, and highly traceable traveller's checks, it seemed the job was going to end in disappointment. With a gun in his back, Risley finally coughed up the half of the numbers that he knew after bravely refusing to reveal them at first. After they'd been punched in, he looked over his shoulder and declared that the alarms were now neutralised. The robbers were finally inside Unit 7's vault. It was shortly before 7 a.m. in the fluorescent lighting revealed a carpet of drab grey containers, no bigger than shoeboxes bound with metal straps and bearing handwritten identification codes. One of the robbers marched up to one of the unprepossessing cartons in the corner and snapped off its lid. Inside, there were 12 perfectly formed bars of pure gold. As if to check that they weren't dreaming, the robbers prized off a few more lids to reveal the same awesome sight. It was an enormous amount to be held in one place at one time, more than the gang could ever have imagined. There was a total of 60 boxes containing 6,800 gold bars, weighing a total of 3.5 tons and worth a staggering £26 million, £26,369,778. They also found several £100,000 in used banknotes locked in 3 safes. One pouch contained traveller's checks worth £200,000. In the others were rough diamonds valued at £113,000. Now, as box after box was opened and the veritable Aladdin's cave of treasure was revealed, the atmosphere became increasingly electrified, as it, with scarcely concealed excitement, the gang hurried, beginning passing bars to their battered transit. Soon this unexpected windfall was starting to make the vehicle's axles bend under the weight. More than one witness later reported seeing an old van with a wheezing engine riding very low on its suspension through the streets of nearby Hounslow. No one within the robbers' immediate circle had any experience of dealing with this amount of gold. The gang had been expecting to find only cash, so the call for help in dealing with this incredible haul would have to be put out far and wide. I'm just going to quickly stop there just to check the chat. Hello there, Joe Delamora. Good to see you. Osada, I think I just did. Was Osada there? Hello there. Good to see you. Right. Now the robbers gathered up everything they could cram into this van as the time tickled away. The atmosphere was buzzing as the team moved the last of the gold out of the side of the loading bay into the vehicle. Virtually no words were exchanged. As one of them said later, you could have cut the silence in half. It was that tense. As that rusting old transit van eventually scraped its way out of the warehouse, though none of the robbers could have known what they were in possession of, something so dangerous that it would eventually cost many of them and their associates their lives. Inside the van, Mick McAvoy and the rest of his team sat completely stunned in silence as the enormity of what they had been just done began to sink in. We just couldn't believe what we had just pulled off, and we kept looking in the back of the van where the gold was, as if it might just disappear and we'd wake up from a dream. Now, back in the warehouse, the alarm was raised when a local mechanic who was servicing one of the Brinks-Mat vans had a problem with the vehicle's alarm system and called the warehouse, only to be told by a terrified security guard, "Phone the fucking police, we've been turned over." He immediately slammed down the phone and rang 999. The lives of a lot of people, both innocent and not so innocent, were about to be blighted forever. McAvoy and Robinson and the rest of the gang split up after a quick meeting at a South London flop house following the raid. They were all under strict instructions not to communicate with each other for at least a month. Usually at flop houses, the proceeds are split between the robbers, but on this occasion, the team all agreed they would have to sit on all the gold for some time before they started to turn it into the hard cash. Excuse me. Not all the robbers were happy about this arrangement, but McAvoy and Robinson made it clear there was no choice in the matter. However, the sheer size of the gold bullion haul was only the start of their problems. McAvoy later told one associate that all the gang members knew only too well that the police would be put under enormous pressure to solve the robbery because of the vast amount of gold that had been stolen. In one fell swoop, the gang had single-handedly humiliated the long arm of the law. Scotland Yard Commander Frank Cater needed the Brinks-Mat job like he needed the proverbial hole in the head. Months before the raid, another firm of the London's robbers had coolly taken 6 million in used banknotes. Sorry, excuse me there. 6 million in used banknotes during on Easter 1983 robbery on a Security Express depot in London's East End. On that occasion, a guard had also been doused in petrol. That job had been dubbed the crime of the decade by the tabloids. Cater wondered if the same gang was now also responsible for the Brinks-Mat raid. Before these two heists, the previous holder of the title had been the Great Train Robbery, which took place near Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire in 1963, and they had netted a relatively paltry £2 million. One senior detective described the Brinks-Mat raid to one reporter as the typical Old Kent armed robbery, executed with customary efficiency and ruthlessness. The police knew perfectly well which corner of London to concentrate their inquiries in, but breaking down the barriers that existed between the law and the gangsters was another thing altogether. Less than a day after the Brinks-Mat robbery, Lloyd's of London announced a reward of 2 million for information leading to the return of the stolen gold, which had already leapt in value by more than £20 an ounce since the robbery had taken place. Rather than disappearing in the days following the robbery, McAvoy and Robinson told the other gang members to make sure they were seen around their usual haunts, because if they went to ground, it would be sure to alert the police of their involvement. Not surprisingly, a word spread across the underworld about the magnitude of the job and the vast amounts of gold that had been stolen. Various top London faces let it be known that they would be pitching for the rights to turn all that gold into cash. The robbery was the simple bit. Now the real fun would begin, said one of those criminals. who knew the raid would end up as an excuse for other villains to muscle in on McAvoy and Robinson's big job. Now, initially, McAvoy and Robinson steadfastly refused to see any of these villains because they didn't want to give the law any excuse to pull them in. They believed that they'd get away with their audacious crime if they kept cool and low-key, but there was one obvious fly in the ointment: Robinson's brother-in-law, Tony Black. He wasn't a villain and was, in the words of one robber, bricking himself. Robinson got a message to Black telling him not to worry, and although the police would probably pull him in as an obvious inside man, as long as he said nothing, they would never be able to get proof of his involvement. Now, of the 6 the Brinks-Mat guards on the duty that morning, Tony Black stuck out to the police like Ronnie Cray at a Boy Scouts meeting. The fact that Black had been out of sight of the others in the minutes before the raid was significant, and within hours the raid being carried out, the police began to put together some damning intelligence on Black, not least of which was that he had a brother-in-law called Brian Robinson. The police knew all about Robinson. Over the previous 2 years, he'd escaped prosecution on 2 armed robbery charges. One was thrown out by a magistrate because of insufficient evidence, the other for handling money taken in the armed raid, and was dropped when the Director of Public Prosecutions also decided that there was not enough evidence to bring a conviction. But the police decided to bide their time when it came to Black, so they held off arresting him and instead put a shadow on him in the hope he might lead detectives to the actual robbers. If looked at, it looked as if McAvoy and Robinson's strict instructions to the whole team that none of the blaggers should even see each other was a good plan. The same applied to any further contact with the wobbly Tony Black, who they all knew was the weakest link of the entire Brinks-Mat job. For almost a week, Black was shadowed by police and seen making numerous nervy calls from phone boxes. However, it seemed that he never actually got to talk to whoever he was calling, because he'd end up slamming the phone down and cursing as he left the phone box after phone box. Black and the other guards were eventually called back to the warehouse to help police make a video reconstruction of exactly what happened. Afterwards, police were struck by how nervous Black looked throughout the reconstruction. Although they knew that wasn't enough evidence in itself to arrest him, they needed a confession, and they were sure that would come in time. The let him stew philosophy was a tried and trusted police technique, and it looked sure to work this time as well. The police just needed to bide their time, and Tony Black would eventually crumble. And at 8 a.m. on Sunday, the 4th of December, just 8 days after the Brinks-Mat robbery, all 6 guards on duty the day of the robbery were taken to Hounslow Police Station for questioning. In fact, it was all a charade because only Tony Black was properly interrogated. For 6 hours, he was questioned and re-questioned about his movements on the day of the robbery, and eventually, Scotland Yard investigator, Inspector Tony Brightwell, rose to his feet and told Black, "There are certain points which have arisen, and as a result of the original statement which you made, the video reconstruction of events during this interview, to put it bluntly, we are not happy with your story. We will leave you to have a rethink." Okay, just going to stop there. Hello there, Suzanne. Good to see you. Now, so they're putting pressure on Tony Black, okay, who's Brian Robinson's brother-in-law. Now, the detective and his colleagues then left the interview room and, using yet another tried and trusted police tactic, let him sweat for more than an hour while they discussed his story over the coffee in the canteen. Brightwell and his colleague returned to the interview room at 4:52 p.m. They were certain of their ground, and the investigators planned to deliver what they hoped would be their coup de grace. Okay, that's not very French of me. Now, they deliberately took their time taking down Black's statement all over again, going through every detail with him. In order to rack up their attention, it wasn't until the early hours of the following day, on the 5th of December 1983, that a detective sergeant accompanied by 2 colleagues completed Black's 21-page statement after more than 8 hours of questioning. Put simply, they wore Tony Black down until he told them about his involvement. Afterwards, Black admitted to the investigators, "I'm feeling much better now. It's like a weight off my mind. It was just too big. I couldn't handle it. There's one thing, though. I'm worried about these people, what they're going to do to me." Minutes later, Commander Frank Cater entered the room and waved his 3 detectives out. They believed they had already knew the identity of one of Robinson's accomplices. Black said he thought the surname of the big man known as Tony was a notorious South London blagger called Tony White. Criminal intelligence had already confirmed that Tony White and another criminal, Mick McAvoy, were known acquaintances of Robinson. It was also that White owned a vehicle similar to a car seen circling the trading estate a few days before the robbery. Now, the 3 detectives who left the interview room went straight downstairs to collect the mugshots. They had already been put to one side from police files. There were 2 folders, each containing 12 photographs of various individuals. In each batch, they placed mugshots of McAvoy and White. Shortly before midnight, after Commander Cater had finished with Black's, DS branch pushed the carefully collated folders under Black's nose. The first file was opened, and the pictures spread across the table. Black immediately pointed to a photo of Mickey McAvoy. "That's Mick," he said. He then confirmed the detective's suspicions. The photograph he pointed to was the man the other guys had dubbed the Bully, aka Mad Mickey McAvoy. They pushed the second folder over the table, and Black then again picked out another photo almost immediately. "That's Tony," he declared. It was a photograph of Tony White. In the early hours of Tuesday, the 6th of December, Tony Black was led back to his cell, understandably wondering if he had just sentenced himself to death. The gang might be still out and about enjoying their liberty, but detectives knew that it was a matter of time before they'd have them under lock and key, thanks to Black. It was obvious from the start there had been an inside man. Detective Tony Brightwell later explained, when Brightwell decided to take all the guards back to the warehouse and film them in situ, talking about the robbery, Black had quickly emerged as the only viable candidate. He was extremely nervous and, in my opinion, obviously lying. When the film was shown to the rest of the flying squad officers, it was rather like watching a B movie where everyone sort of jeered when he came on. Black was not a professional criminal. Having made a full detailed confession, he then agreed with detectives to turn Queen's evidence. Out of the original 6-man gang, he fingered the 3 of them, Robinson, McAvoy, and Tony White. But detectives had decided to continue playing a waiting game for the time being. They suspected that once the trio knew that Black had grasped on them, they'd probably try and make a run for it. The detectives were hoping the villains might first lead them to the gold. It was a risky strategy, but the sheer magnitude of the raid meant that none of the usual rules applied. Okay, so there we go, everyone. I'm just going to turn to the chat. Okay, hello there, ALV. There's just a couple of you that I need to. Here we go. Okay, just give it. Got everyone there. Got ALV, Dave T. Good to see you all. Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to quickly go through the comments because that's covered the heist. Okay, but now I'm going to there is the aftermath that I'm going to go through. Good man, good to see you. Hello there, Suzanne. Okay. James, Thank you. I tried to get tongue-tied, Paul. Okay, right. So part two, as they call it in the book, but for me, I'm just for you. It is the aftermath. Now, as we know, the Brinks-Mat gang knew that Tony Black had been picked up and was singing like the proverbial canary, but now they faced a dilemma. If they stashed the gold and disappeared, it would be seen as clear confirmation that they'd been on the raid. They decided instead to stay put. In doing so, they pinned their hopes on two factors. The first was the strength of the alibis that they had all created as a precaution to cover their tracks, and the second was the belief that Black might still not actually crack to the point where he would actually identify them. Now, although they feared that was highly unlikely, unsurprisingly, police surveillance experts at Scotland Yard Specialist C11 unit focused on Brian Robinson and Mick McAvoy. Initially, McAvoy proved to be cautious with his movements to the point of the near paranoia, but he then made a classic error by suddenly quitting his council house in Dulwich and moving into a mansion on the borders of Kent. He also brought two Rottweilers and named them Brinks and Matt. He clearly got his hands on some of the cash from the raid. Some of the other gang members were irritated by his clumsiness. Keeping a low profile was paramount, but he just didn't seem to appreciate that and gave the impression of being more interested in making sure that the underworld knew he was the money. But it wasn't just the other criminals he was looking to send a message. He couldn't resist, explained one old South London associate. Mickey hated the Cozzers. He liked the idea of them suffering a bit. It was obvious all of it would be just to wind them up and make them even more determined to nick him. He should have just sat tight. Nevertheless, police continued to sit on McAvoy, Robinson and White following Black's confession, watching and waiting in the hopes that at least one of them led the cops to the gold. It turned into a standoff. The villains didn't want to arouse the cops' suspicions, and the cops didn't want to show their cards in case they hadn't got enough to make any charges stick. It was a typical game of cat and mouse. In the end, the police decided that they had to swoop just in case the suspected robbers disappeared. So, in the early hours of a cold December morning, 11 days after the bullion robbery, Tony, Mickey and Brian were taken to separate police stations. By making sure they couldn't communicate with each other, the cops were looking to prevent them working out that they had been grassed up by Black. It was imperative that the men were kept separate so they did not communicate with each other. Another 3 people were also detained in relation to the handling of the proceeds from the raid, and they were White's wife Margaret, McAvoy's first wife Jacqueline, and Mrs. Patricia Dallaghan, who lived in the house in southeast London where Black claimed the robbery had been planned. Now, in the interrogation room at Heathrow Police Station, Tony White was certainly an uncommunicative and denied all knowledge of the robbery. Police wanted to know why there were groceries in the boot of his car and packed suitcases in his bedroom. They also wanted to know why White's young son was not at home. Officers believed White had been expecting a visit when the police raid occurred and he sent his son away. They also reckoned he cleaned his house to remove any forensic evidence that might have linked him to the raid. "If I sat here with my mouth shut, you haven't got fuck all. I know that," White told one officer. At West Drayton Police Station near Heathrow, Brian Robinson was also cautioned. He gave them what appeared to be a cast iron alibi. The detectives rolled their eyes and took it down, knowing full well that professionals like Robinson always cooked up an alibi before any job. Over at Chiswick Police Station, Mick McAvoy was proving just as frustrating for the police officers. And by the end of the following day, all the detectives involved in interrogating the 3 men compared notes. Robinson was politely denied any wrongdoing. White had been aggressively blunt, and McAvoy maintained a stony silence. Robinson had a detailed alibi backed up by his wife, his sick mother, and a brother, who will all have to be interviewed by the detectives. White could bank only on the word of his wife to confirm a Saturday morning lie-in. McAvoy would not divulge his alibi unless his solicitor was there to hear it. The police had Black's detailed confession, but so far the only evidence against the three men was circumstantial, and that was not much of that. Naturally, all three men refused to sign the contemporaneous notes of the interviews, which they feared this might incriminate them. They knew that the veracity of the unsigned records could therefore be questioned in court. Any mistakes the three robbers might have made, any slips that opened up a chink in their armour, could be dismissed as fabrication without signatures at the bottom of each page. Any such documents could be labelled so-called verbals, a well-known practice of corrupt officers at the time, in which prisoners' statements were completely fabricated in order to guarantee their guilt. Within a few days, legal wrangles in the High Court looked to set to release all those who had been pulled in by the police in relation to the Brinks-Mat robbery. Now, the starring role went to a lawyer whose legal skills would be called upon by a number of other people involved in the Brinks-Mat gold into cash. Tony White's brief, Henry Milner, was an engaging public school educated character who specialised in representing people accused of serious crimes such as armed robbery. He issued a writ of habeas corpus, essentially a demand that detained individuals had the chance to go before a judge rather than be held in indefinite without trial. Now, on behalf of all six people held by the police with the raid, Mr. Milner, as all his clients called him, had already earned himself the respect of some of the most powerful criminals in London. He had no fear about the twilight world of gang crime, and he was not even shy about saying how he'd helped turn cases around, especially if his clients had been verbaled up. He once explained, "It's a lot of fun defending criminal cases." Henry Milner's North London upbringing, Jewish boarding school education in Oxford, and a degree at the London School of Economics could be further removed from the backgrounds of the Brinks-Mat robbery gang. At weekends, Mr. Milner retreated even further from the London Underworld by pursuing his three hobbies: Tottenham Hotspur, bridge, and traditional American music. But to his clients, he remained the man they could trust to get them out the tightest spots imaginable. Legal Eagle, Mr. Milner's one-man operation, offered an exclusive service to 10 or 12 rich clients a year. Mr. Milner offered an entirely professional service, and all his clients came through word of mouth. His modest office was squeezed between two jewellery shops in London's Hatton Garden. His only employee, secretary Eileen, had worked for him for many years. Through Mr. Milner's tiny waiting room had nothing but a handful of glossy mags to flick through. The lawyer's own office was panelled within a dark oak and constantly filled with clouds of smoke from his ever-present fat Cuban cigars. Now, they sat on the desk in a walnut veneer box crafted in a prison workshop and sent to him by a former client. Mr. Milner's first big professional breakthrough as a brief had come back in 1978 when he represented one of London's best-known faces who, as Mr. Milner later admitted, appeared on an Old Bailey regular as Frank Sinatra at the Albert Hall. Mr. Milner's lovable rogue was eventually acquitted of criminal charges in 6 successive courts. That was when the word went out that Henry Milner was a brief to be trusted. Now, Mr. Milner had once asked if there was any cases he couldn't handle. He responded, "That's a difficult question because I do a lot of cases the public finds distasteful, like drugs, but I never handle cases involving sexual offences on elderly people or young children." Luckily, Mr. Milner was a born optimist. "You've got to look confident even if you don't feel it," he explained. "If you show weakness or fear, they'll jump on it. Defendants are as shrewd as anything. They know whether you are on the ball." Mr. Milner didn't have a close relationship with any of his heavyweight clients, especially the so-called superstar gangsters. He said he'd even been out socialising with them, apart from having the occasional sandwich at lunchtime. One retired blagger explained, "Mr. Milner's a real pro, a complete gent. He doesn't have to hang around with the likes of us to understand the criminal mind. The guy's bloody brilliant. If you've got him on your side, you're about 50% more likely to walk out of that court free, man. He's a tasty operator." Mr. Milner prided himself on always having complete control of the case. That meant deciding which witnesses to call, influencing the counsel's closing speech, and occasionally putting his foot down. He was also renowned for picking up the barristers with a knack of winning. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Milner was well accustomed to the old age question from many of his clients: "What are my chances?" To his credit, he always gave the straightest possible answer, although he did once admit to a journalist, "You start with hope as very, very poor, 50%, evens or quite good. If you put it above good, you're in trouble if they're found guilty." So when the Brinks-Mat came around in 1983, Mr. Milner was sitting pretty to receive a windfall of clients. First through the door was Tony White, followed by McAvoy. Others were soon to pay a visit. Back in the court day, less than a month after the robbery, Victor Durand, QC, read a sworn statement by Henry Milner that in effect changed the police on all to charge all 6 prisoners or release them. At the time, the law clearly stipulated how long the police were allowed to hold suspects in custody without charge, unless it was under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Durand informed the judge, Mr. Justice Taylor, that all the prisoners had been denied their right to legal advice, and Milner's statement said he had repeatedly asked for access to the prisoners but had been stopped from seeing them by the flying squad officers. So when counsel representing Scotland Yard replied that the habeas corpus action would be defended, the case was adjourned until the next morning, but it never reopened. At 9:30 that night, White was charged, followed by Robinson and McAvoy. The other 3 were released. The next morning, the 3 robbery suspects were brought to Felton Magistrates Court and remanded in custody to the charge of stealing gold and other valuables worth 28 million from the Brinks-Mat warehouse near Heathrow Airport. Back in West London, detectives investigating the Brinks-Mat robbery suspected that John Littlelegs Lloyd was one of the original 6 members of the gang who robbed the warehouse. Lloyd had disappeared after being tipped off that the police were onto him. Indeed, he didn't resurface again until 9 years later, when he insisted that he hadn't been one of the robbers, and the Crown Prosecution Service announced that there was insufficient evidence to proceed against him. Despite claims he was thousands of miles from London, for much of the time Lloyd was actually in the capital of Kent. Yet such was Lloyd's status in his old haunts that he could drink and live openly without the police ever being informed. That was a measure of the criminal respect for Littlelegs. Almost the criminal fraternity, the Brinks-Mat robbery had already become the stuff of legends. The tabloids quickly dubbed it the robbery of the century, while others referred to it as brilliantly executed raid. To stumble upon so much gold and then get away with enough set dozens of people up financially for life, and that was the sort of dream scenario that few villains ever hoped for, even if 3 of the robbers had already been arrested. But the sheer size of the Brinks-Mat haul of the gold bullion robbery continued to create a huge problem, because the gang needed a mechanism, a conduit through which the gold could travel. It had to be smelted and sold back into the gold industry before it could be turned into cash. In the South London Underworld, there was a great fear that Robinson, McAvoy and White would turn supergrasses in exchange for lighter sentences. McAvoy and Robinson were particularly outraged by such rumours, because informing on their criminal associates was something they would never even vaguely consider. Now, the gang had to look outside their close circle of associates to find people to handle the gold. Though the 3 members were behind bars, still pulling the strings, they inevitably had to allow others to get involved, something that made the whole laundering operation even more risky. After using a wobbly character like Tony Black as their inside man, this turned out to be their second big mistake they made. Here were villains who were known to each other for years, and now they were having to put their trust in people such as Kenneth Noy. Introduced to the gang by John Littlelegs, McAvoy and Robinson had heard whispers about Noy. Some even said he was a police grass, though those sort of accusations are thrown around in all heavy criminal circles, and they were usually taken with a pinch of salt. But the amount of gold involved was so large that everyone felt that they were all treading on thin ice. One false move, they could either be dead or in prison. Noy and his associate Brian Reeder had taught themselves everything there was to know about gold over the previous few years. The precious metal had become a favourite commodity, with which to swindle the British government out of that value-added tax. A 15% premium levied on a variety of goods, including items from gold where they were sold, paid at the time by the buyer to the person selling the gold. It should have been returned to HM Custom Excise. In this initial discussion, Noy had convinced McAvoy and Robinson that not only was he the best man to help them turn the gold into cash, but there were a variety of scams that could easily be operated in order to deprive the taxman of his share. One was to smuggle gold into the country, then sell it to a reputable dealer. The 15% VAT would then be pocketed by the smugglers. Okay, right, folks. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to quickly check the chat. Okay, hello there. Good to see you, Miss Cranky. Good to see you. Joe Delamora. Let me put my camera on so I can address you all. It's only right. As I say, I appreciate you coming. I just want to give this opportunity now. Is there any questions? So we've done the heist. I've given you the backdrop. I've obviously given you the build-up in the last episode. If there's anyone in the chat that wants to speak to me about this or wants to put, I could drop a link. Because tomorrow I'm going to go through more and the aftermath on what happens with the gold, how it's going to be smelted down. Obviously, people are going to go to jail, but as well, you know, this book is going to cover obviously the not so good parts. People are going to start losing their lives, but it's a story. And as I say, I would like to thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate it. Okay, let's have a look. Okay. Let's see who's there. Anyone in the chat? Let's have a look. Hello there, Miss Cranky. Thank you, Paul. Paul, do you want to? Have you got any questions? Or we can go on Avatar. Do you want to jump up? Anyone? We can have a little discussion. I appreciate it's getting late, so if anyone wants to jump up, we can have a quick 5 minutes. If no one wants to join me, I can close the telecast and I'll catch up with you all again tomorrow. And as I say, I really do appreciate you coming, all of you. Thank you, Dave T. I really appreciate that. As I say, yeah, we'll touch base on it, and I'll go in a little bit more depth tomorrow. You guys give me the encouragement to do this, and I appreciate that. I can get this story out to you. I know a lot of you from the States, and I just wanted, yeah, absolutely, Paul. Drop some comments later, and what I'll do, Paul, if you think of comments, drop them underneath the video, and I'll have a look, and then I can answer them on the next show. So the plan is to do it at the same time tomorrow, okay, at 9 o'clock. As I say, I'm going to do these frequent. I'm going to try and get these a little bit smaller now. We've got the heist out of the way, and what I will say now, if there isn't anything more, I'd like to wish you all a lovely evening or a lovely day wherever you are in the world. Thank you for viewing. Can't do this without you.